There was a federal judge who issued a ruling related to President Trump's order to begin construction of the border wall. And while I do want to briefly indulge in what the judge said in this particular case, I want to broadly speak about the ongoing relentless attack to undermine President Trump and his ability really to function as President of the United States. This judge, and this is Judge Haywood Gilliam, Jr., appointed by President Barack Obama in December 2014, ruled essentially in a case that was filed by the Sierra Club that President Trump cannot use the discretionary funding that has been transferred by the military from other projects to the border wall, that President Trump cannot use that money to begin construction or continue construction of the border wall. I want to mention first what this hearing was. It was for a preliminary injunction, and that's a unique, specific thing in law. A preliminary injunction means the judge had to have found that the plaintiff, this being the Sierra Club, had to prove it was likely to succeed on the merits, so it's probably going to win, is likely to suffer irreparable harm if the preliminary injunction is not issued. So irreparable harm to the Sierra Club and its interests, not to America for having an insecure border, to make that clear, and that the balance of equities tips in the plaintiff's favor, and that the injunction is in the public interest. So this judge found all those bases in favor of the Sierra Club and said essentially that President Trump cannot use that money to go forward with the border wall. Well, the case will end up in the Supreme Court, of course, and I'm going to guess that the Supreme Court is going to find that President Trump had the right to issue this order. But the reason I raise this case today is this. There is ongoing in this country within the judiciary, the federal courts, the district and appellate courts, and in the media, an underlying relentless argument that President Trump really doesn't have the right to be president. He doesn't have the right to conduct the presidency. He doesn't have the right to do things that are clearly within the scope of his responsibility as commander-in-chief, as president of the United States. With respect to the border wall funding in particular, this is a ruling under a law, a federal law that President Trump relied on that essentially said that the president has a right to issue an emergency order, say it's an emergency at the border. We have to get the border where there's no other security. We have to have the border wall built. President Trump declared that emergency. Anyone who's been watching the news and seeing that the southern border is overwhelmed with people pouring over the border can see we do have an emergency at the southern border. So President Trump relied on a federal law that said he has the right to do things like this, to issue an emergency order in instances like this, and use money already allotted by the Congress to the military that, again, decided that he could use that money. They moved money from other projects to the border wall. An interesting statement came out I wanted to share with you from Attorney General Barr. Attorney General Barr said that he is troubled by the use of troubled by a single judge vetoing an entire decision by the president. And in particular, this is a federal judge not just saying that the border wall can't happen in a certain place, but issuing an injunction for the entire use of the border wall funding by the administration until the case makes it all the way to the Supreme Court. By way of contrast, in terms of how often these kinds of injunctions are issued, it's really rather amazing. Under the Justice Department, according to the Justice Department, an average of 1.5 such national or universal injunctions were issued every year under the administrations of President Reagan, Clinton, and Bush. Under President Obama, the average rose to 2.5. That's the number of times a federal court issued an order with a broad national stop everything while we review this policy. How many times the courts have done that to President Trump? 18 times a year, 37 such injunctions. This is basically the federal court echoing the mindset of the American left, saying we're just not going to let President Trump be president. And another quick story I want to hit in the first five relates to President Trump's recent trip to Japan. You know, he's back, or he's flying back, or he is back now, but he was visiting Japan. And essentially, he's working with Japan on a variety of issues, trade, concerns about China, about North Korea. But there was a reporter talk about just the courts won't let President Trump be president. Well, neither will the media. There was a reporter who actually tweeted out that President Trump, during his time in Japan, had said that the North Korean dictator, Kim Jong-un, would be a better president than Joe Biden would. He didn't say anything like that. But this reporter tweeted it out, got, I don't remember the number, but thousands of times retweeted, commented on. In the media, the reporter for Time, I think it was for Time magazine, finally had to say, by the way, he didn't say that, I just made that up. He didn't acknowledge he made it up. He took the tweet down and said, yeah, that didn't really happen. And I guess in closing the first 5 days, I want to say it's very troubling in our country. We have an underlying sense that the ruling elite, the smart people, the people in charge, the media, the courts, the American left in Washington, simply can continue to treat President Trump as though he doesn't really have the right to be treated as president. This is unacceptable. There should be more protest, more outrage, more calling out of the left's unwillingness to acknowledge that President Trump is president because the majority of the American voters wanted him to be president, because the system we have that elects a president chose him.